The room is already tight before a single question even lands. You can feel it. That kind of heavy, pressurized silence that fills a studio when everyone in it knows exactly what's about to happen. Mark Carney is sitting there under those harsh lights, and the journalist across from him isn't warming up. There's no small talk, no easing into the topic. The word used right out of the gate is collapsing. Not struggling, not slowing, collapsing. And from that one word forward, nothing in this conversation ever fully recovers. Because here's the thing. When you call Canada's economy collapsing on live television, directly in front of the man who is supposed to be managing it, you're not just asking a question, you're making an accusation. You're forcing a confrontation between two completely different versions of reality, one that lives in charts and policy rooms, and one that lives in every household in this country where people are quietly rearranging their budgets, cutting things they used to take for granted, and wondering how it keeps feeling like they're falling further behind no matter what the headlines say. And Carney knows this. He's not a simple politician. This is a man who ran the Bank of Canada, who then ran the Bank of England, who has spent decades swimming in exactly these kinds of macroeconomic waters. He knows what the numbers say. He knows how to present a framework. He knows the language of central banking and GDP and rate cycles better than almost anyone sitting in that kind of seat. But knowledge of the system and ability to defend the system in front of people who are being crushed by the system are two very different things. And that gap right there is what makes this interview so uncomfortable to watch. Let's start with what the actual data says. Because before we get to the confrontation, we need to understand what is being confronted. Canada's real GDP grew by just 1.7% in 2025 overall. That sounds like a number that's technically positive, technically not a recession, technically survivable, but when you dig into what that 1.7% actually represents, the picture gets much darker. The fourth quarter of 2025 saw the economy contract by 0.6% on an annualized basis. The second quarter contracted too, shrinking by 0.9%. That means in a single calendar year, Canada posted negative growth in two separate quarters, not consecutive, which is the textbook definition of a recession, but 2 out of 4. 2 out of 4 quarters where the economy actually shrank. And that 1.7% annual figure was only kept alive by a surge in defense spending and some inventory effects that economists themselves describe as unlikely to be repeated. The Bank of Canada, in its January 2026 monetary policy report, had projected flat growth for the fourth quarter. The economy came in at negative 0.6 instead. It missed badly. It was the only G7 country to post a contraction in the fourth quarter at all. Every other major advanced economy either grew or held steady. Canada alone went backwards while the rest of the world kept moving, and this is happening after the Bank of Canada cut its policy rate by 275 basis points across 2024 and 2025. 275 basis points. That is not a small adjustment. That is the central bank throwing the full weight of monetary policy at the problem. Rates went from 5% all the way down to 2.25%. One of the most aggressive easing cycles Canada has seen outside of an outright crisis. And after all of that, growth is sitting at 1.7% for the full year, with 2 quarters of negative output embedded inside it. The medicine went in. The patient is still struggling to stand up. So when the journalist looks at Carney and says the economy is collapsing, Carney pushes back. And this is where the interview starts to fracture, because his pushback is technically accurate. Unemployment at 6.7% is not 11 or 12%. The way it was during the recession of 1980. It is not 14%, the way it was during the pandemic collapse of 2020. So we're not at the worst moments Canada has faced. He's right about that. But that kind of comparison only works if the standard you're measuring against is full catastrophe. If your benchmark for whether things are acceptable is that they haven't become as bad as the absolute worst points in modern history, you're setting an extremely low bar for the people who are actually living through this right now. And then there's the oil story, because hovering over all of this, layered on top of already strained household finances and already weak growth projections, is the war in the Middle East that nobody can ignore anymore. The United States and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th of 2026. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply passes, was effectively closed. Global oil prices surged. Gas prices across Canada averaged more than $1.80 per liter as of early April 2026. That's compared to about $1.32 per liter just 1 year earlier, a 36% increase in fuel costs in 12 months. And oil prices don't stay in your gas tank. They move through the entire economy. Transportation costs go up, food shipping costs go up, construction materials get more expensive, heating bills climb. Every single cost that has any connection to energy, which is nearly every cost in modern life, starts ratcheting upward the moment oil spikes. The Bank of Canada, which had been holding its policy rate at 2.25%, now faces one of the most uncomfortable dilemmas a central bank can encounter. On one side, you have an economy that is fragile, with growth projections already being revised down to around 1.1% for 2026. On the other side, you have new inflationary pressure coming from a global oil shock that has nothing to do with domestic monetary policy and everything to do with a military conflict halfway around the world. If they raise rates to fight the oil-driven inflation, they risk crushing whatever growth momentum is left in the system. If they hold or cut, they risk letting inflation run above target at a moment when household budgets are already stretched beyond what most Canadians can comfortably absorb. This is the dilemma that Carney is sitting inside of when the journalist puts the numbers on the table. Economic weakness combined with rising inflation is not a normal policy problem. It is not something you can simply solve with either rate cuts or rate hikes. It is the kind of structural trap that economists give a name to: stagflation, stagnant growth plus rising prices. The economic environment where the tools in the toolbox start working against each other, where helping one problem makes the other worse, and where the people who are most financially exposed have nowhere to run. And that is the context into which the journalist drops the question about grocery prices. Because this is where the interview stops sounding like a policy briefing and starts sounding like something else entirely. Since 2022, grocery prices in Canada have risen by roughly 22%. Not this year, not over the past few months, over 3 years. A cumulative 22% increase for the food that people need to feed themselves and their families, while other consumer prices have risen by about 13% over the same period. Food ran almost twice as hot as everything else. And in 2025, food inflation reached 5% by December, the highest reading since late 2023. The Bank of Canada itself put out a research note confirming this. Beef prices alone were 17% higher in December 2025 than they were in December 2024. A single year, 17% just for beef. Canada's food price report for 2026 projects another 4 to 6% increase in overall food prices through the year. The average family of 4 is expected to spend nearly $17,600 on food in 2026. That's roughly $1,000 more than the year before. Meat prices are expected to continue climbing, with beef potentially rising another 7%. Even items that used to be considered affordable, the staples people turned to when they couldn't afford the premium stuff, are no longer safe. The center of the grocery store, the processed goods and shelf-stable products that families rely on when budgets are tight, is no longer a refuge from inflation. Researchers at Dalhousie University said that explicitly heading into this year, that's not going to be the case in 2026. The places people used to hide from food price pressure are now catching up. And this is where Carney runs into trouble in the interview, because he can say correctly that headline inflation is close to the 2% target. He can say correctly that this reflects a stabilization in the pace of price increases. But stabilization in the rate of increase is not the same as prices coming back down. It is not the same as relief. If your grocery bill was $500 a month 3 years ago and it is now $610 a month, a reduction in food inflation from 8% to 5% doesn't make that bill feel any lighter. You are still spending $110 more every single month than you were before any of this started. The pain is baked in. The damage is already done. The lower inflation rate just means the wound is bleeding a little slower. It is not the same as healing, as the journalist makes this point in a way that cuts through all the policy language. People don't live in global markets. They live in local bills. And there is no clean rebuttal to that. Not because Carney lacks intelligence or economic knowledge, but because the statement is simply true. The family trying to figure out whether to buy ground beef or switch entirely to cheaper proteins is not consoled by knowing that the global oil shock is being transmitted equally to resource-rich and resource-poor nations alike. They are not thinking about the Strait of Hormuz when they are standing in the meat aisle. They are thinking about whether they have enough in their account to get through the week. What makes the room so tense is that Carney tries to hold the global context together as an explanation, and it is an honest explanation. He points out that Canada, as a major oil exporter, is actually in a better position than many other countries when oil prices spike. The energy sector represents about 10% of Canadian GDP, roughly twice the share it holds in the United States. Higher oil revenues help offset the macro impact for the country as a whole. He's right. For Alberta and Saskatchewan, rising oil prices are a windfall. For the national accounts, there is at least a partial buffer that many other economies don't have. But here is the problem. The buffer exists at a national level. It shows up in GDP figures and government royalties and corporate earnings in the energy sector. It does not show up as cheaper gas at the pump for a commuter in Hamilton or Brampton or Moncton. The people who are paying $1.80 per liter to fill up their car, the people whose grocery bills are climbing because everything from transportation to packaging to refrigeration runs on energy, those people are not receiving a direct transfer from Canada's oil export revenues. The benefit is captured somewhere in the system. The cost is paid directly, every single day, at the gas pump and at the checkout counter. There is another layer to this that doesn't get discussed enough, and it came up obliquely in the interview around debt. During the low interest rate environment of the early part of this decade, Canadian households took on enormous amounts of debt. It felt manageable when rates were near zero. Variable rate mortgages, home equity lines of credit, car loans, consumer credit, all of it was priced against a baseline that has now changed fundamentally. The Bank of Canada cut rates significantly in 2024 and 2025, bringing the policy rate down to 2.25%. But for many households renewing fixed-rate mortgages in 2025 and 2026, the payments are still going up. FCC Economics has estimated that households renewing 5-year fixed-rate mortgages in 2026 could face payment increases of nearly 20% compared to when they originally signed. 20% more going to mortgage payments every single month. At the same time that groceries are up 22% over 3 years. At the same time that gas is 36% more expensive than a year ago. At the same time that the unemployment rate has ticked up to 6.7% and Canada lost 84,000 jobs in February 2026 alone, the single worst monthly jobs loss in 4 years. Those numbers don't cancel each other out. They stack. They pile on top of each other until the household budget that used to bend under pressure starts to break. And then there is the population dimension that sits underneath all of this. Canada's population actually declined in 2025 for the first time on record, a decrease of just over 100,000 people, the result of a deliberate government effort to reduce immigration after years of population growth that had overwhelmed housing markets and strained public services. On one level, that policy makes sense. The growth of the previous few years had created its own set of crises around housing availability and affordability, but a shrinking population is not neutral for an economy. Consumer spending, which accounts for roughly 60% of Canadian GDP, depends on people being there to spend. Business investment depends on expectations of future demand. Housing construction depends on projected household formation. When the population stops growing, all of those calculations shift, and they don't all shift in comfortable directions. So what you have, sitting across from Mark Carney in that studio, is not just a bad quarterly GDP number or a food inflation figure. What you have is a convergence, weak underlying growth with 2 quarters of contraction in 2025, a new oil shock from the Iran war arriving on top of already fragile household finances, food prices that have risen 22% in 3 years and are projected to rise another 4 to 6% this year. Mortgage renewals hitting hundreds of thousands of households at rates significantly higher than what they originally locked in. A labor market that just shed 84,000 jobs in a single month. A population that is no longer growing and in some measures is actually declining. Business investment that has been stagnant for 4 consecutive years. And all of it arriving simultaneously, all of it pressing on the same household budgets at the same time. That is the picture the journalist is holding up. And the reason the room goes quiet after the line about survival, the reason there is that moment where the studio just seems to absorb the weight of what was said, is that the line isn't rhetorical. It isn't an exaggeration for effect. It is what 1 in 4 Canadian households experiencing food insecurity actually feels like. It is what 330,000 monthly visits to the Daily Bread Food Bank in Toronto looks like in practice, compared to the 60,000 visits a month that same food bank was recording before the pandemic. These are the human coordinates of the economic abstraction. Carney is not wrong that Canada avoided the technical definition of a recession in 2025. He is not wrong that unemployment at 6.7% is not the catastrophe of 1980 or 2020. He is not wrong that the Bank of Canada stands ready to respond as conditions evolve, or that global oil shocks affect every country, or that Canada's energy sector provides some cushion against the worst outcomes. None of those things are wrong. But the gap between what is technically accurate and what people are actually experiencing is enormous, and no amount of correct framing fully closes it when someone is standing in a grocery store trying to figure out whether they can afford the ground beef this week. That gap is what the interview is really about. Not GDP figures or inflation targets or rate decisions. The gap between a system that is functioning, technically, on paper, according to the metrics that economists and central bankers use to assess health, and a reality where millions of people are quietly restructuring their lives around scarcity, cutting spending not because they want to, but because there is no other option, deferring purchases they need to make because the month runs out before the paycheck goes far enough. When Carney says he stood ready to respond as needed, you believe him. When he says the risks to growth are tilted to the downside, you believe that too. When he says the war in Iran has added a new layer of uncertainty, that is undeniably true. But what you also can't stop thinking about watching that interview is the single question that hangs in the air after all the data has been laid out and all the frameworks have been offered and all the global context has been explained. If everything is improving, why does life still feel this hard? Not for some Canadians, for most of them. For the people who are not distressed statistics or edge cases, but simply ordinary families trying to live ordinary lives in a country where the numbers say one thing and the checkout counter says something else entirely. That's what makes this moment matter beyond the politics of it, beyond whether Carney handles the pressure well, or whether the journalist presses too hard, or whether the framing is fair. The real confrontation is not between two people in a studio. It's between a system and the people it's supposed to serve, played out in real time, with no resolution in sight, while the cameras are still rolling.